So for my research proposal, I decided to focus on comprehension difficulties with students with autism by evaluating or by assessing these difficulties through the simple view and reading comprehension and this whole to part instruction. So my research question is, what is the best assessment for determining reading comprehension difficulties in students with autism spectrum disorders, simple view and reading comprehension or whole to part instruction? This is just sort of an overview of what I'm going to cover. I'll just go ahead and skip over that. So the focus of my study, as I said, is by evaluating or assessing students through the simple view of reading with reading comprehension and whole to part, using the Morris Informal Reading Inventory. And for those of you who are not familiar, the Morris Informal Reading Inventory is from a professor, Dr. Morris, who recently retired at Appalachian State. He was an amazing professor and even more amazing in what he did as a reading specialist. And he developed these reading assessments allowing us to determine difficulties with student reading abilities. And so by using this simple view and whole to part, I'm going to assess the kids with the Morris Informal Reading Inventory. So that's going to be kids with autism between the ages of 7 and 10. So what is simple view and whole to part? So simple view states that the primary goal of reading is comprehension, and in order to achieve this, one needs to have the skills in decoding and listening comprehension. Decoding is the ability of rapid naming, so fluency, and listening comprehension is the understanding of linguistic information relying on the knowledge of many areas of language. Whole to part is an instructional approach where students are introduced to the whole, in this case, reading and comprehension, and then scaffolded in parts of comprehension. So we're going to take this whole and identify and work on little bits at a time. As I said, never mind. So basically, there is not a lot of research in this area, especially research regarding the Morris Informal Reading Inventory for students with autism spectrum disorders. But I did evaluate 6 other articles or research studies and listed here regarding working with students with autism and the simple view instructional approach. So for this design, I decided to use correlational. Correlational studies are best used when wanting to predict factors of desirable or undesirable outcomes. So it's perfect for this assessment type because I'm trying to decide if the simple view or whole to part works best. So counterbalanced, I considered that in terms of the order of the assessment. So in order to get rid of this variability of assessment order affecting the data, I decided to break the two groups up, I decided to break the group up into 2 individual groups. And then the groups will receive a different order of the assessment. So one will get simple view first, followed by whole to part, and the other will get whole to part first, followed by simple view. And it's important to note that these 2 groups are going to be equal in terms of age and gender, just to try and eliminate that as well. So participants, like I said, all need to have a diagnosis of ASD. There's going to be at least 40 between the ages of 7 and 10, male, female. They will all receive the same instruction, but order will depend on what group that they're in. And exclusionary criteria, I decided to eliminate students with a diagnosis of neurological disorders who are nonverbal, disability other than ASD. For example, they have a diagnosis of ADHD as well, or hyperlexia, and who has scores below baseline requirements. And the reason I did this was to try and eliminate the variabilities of, saying, well, the student didn't do very well here, but it could be because they have this learning disability, or, they have hyperlexia. And then for students who are nonverbal, even though they often have communication devices, it did pose a limitation in them being able to read orally to you. All right, the setting. So consistent with previous studies that I had mentioned above, we are going to have the participants do the study at their school in their regular ELA or English Language Arts classrooms during their regular time. This will help. We want to also make sure that only one student is in the room at a time because we want to avoid distractions oftentimes with students with autism spectrum disorders, they will start demonstrating echolalia, or they will maybe trigger another student. And so we want to try and eliminate these stressors of like sudden change and other students by just sort of reducing that, by keeping things the same as much as possible and keeping it to one student in the classroom at a time. All right, so screening. So consistent with other studies, I decided to use the ICD-10, so the International Classification of Disease, which out of the 5 of 6 studies, 5 of them did reevaluate students, and 3 of those 5 used this as a form of reevaluating their students. And one of those studies decided to have an external diagnostic team just to help eliminate bias. And so this will really help place students where they are if they do have autism or not. The Morris Informal Inventory does have a beginner reader section, and that's broken up into 4 parts. So the first part is alphabet recognition, and that's just seeing if the kids know their alphabet, because if we're going to have them in this study, we want to make sure that they know their alphabet, their letters. We also want to make sure that they have concept of word, concept of print. When they read, are they aware of the separation of the words? Are they aware that what and were are actually 2 separate words? We want to evaluate spelling, so by asking the kids, this here has first and second grade list, but we're just going to ask the kids the first grade list and just see what kind of information they produce to try and eliminate students that may not understand those phonemes and everything. Word recognition is their ability to quickly read out words, which does follow closely with the simple view, and so basically in 60 seconds it's how many words can the student read. So baseline will be used through this WRMT, which was consistent with at least 3 of the studies, and it's just having the kids identify words and identify their reading and listening comprehension, so the reading aloud and having something read aloud to them, followed by comprehension questions. How do they do? So this gives us a grade level of where they're at for those different activities. Oh, forgot to write a questionnaire sample, but the teacher questionnaire is going to go to all the teachers, asking them to pretty much state, like, what does the student do here? What do they have difficulties with? What do you find to be their strengths and weaknesses? And then that will give us an idea of what we're looking for in our own assessments. So the independent variable will be the order of which instruction is received, so receiving the simple view first, being read to, and then listening silently, and the frequency to measure the independent variable. Dependent will be the results of the order, and frequency will be used to measure as we're looking how many times participants made errors in their assessments. Whoops. This is just a quick look at the Morris Informal Reading Inventory, and here we have a good outline of basically how the study is going to be divided. So you see we have the 40 participants broken up into 2 groups. Each are going to receive the same spelling assessment, each are going to receive the same word identification assessment, each are going to receive the same oral reading assessment, which is Form A, and then they break off into their 2 groups. So the first group is going to get silent reading first, which is Form B, followed by being read to, Form C, it's a little cut off there, and the second group is going to be read to and then do silent reading. So what are these things? So spelling. So basically spelling is just a way of being able to see what their abilities are in decoding. What are their skills? What are they able to do? And so we're just going to take the words that are read aloud to them. How do they spell them? It's going to increase in grade level difficulty. The examiner is going to stop when 7 or more words are misspelled, and then see like what their highest level is. What grade level are they at? Where do they stand? The same thing is going to be done with word identification. So they're going to have words that are going to be flashed to them for about half a second. And there's 20 words per grade level with a 3-second wait period for the next one's flashed, and just scoring to see how many words is the student able to say. Would this, and if they get it wrong, then they get to see it without any time, but basically it's like, well, what are we looking at? What are the students able to do? Then we're going to do oral reading, and again, all three of these are things that are going to stay consistent amongst the two groups. And so students are going to be asked to read passages out loud. They're going to be timed. The examiner is going to write down any mistakes that the student makes, and then they are going to score them up and see, where does the student lie? What grade level are they at? Why are they at that grade level? What is so difficult for them when they read, by looking at things like reading rate, oral reading, number of errors, and all that information. Silent reading is where it starts to differ. So group 1 will receive this instruction first. And so basically it's students being given grade level passage and asked to read them silently in their head, followed by comprehension questions, which I will talk about here in a second. Listening comprehension will be received by group 2 first, and so that's basically the same thing, except the examiner is going to play a pre-recorded tape of probably the researcher reading the passage out loud, and then they're going to ask the students questions after the tape has been played. So comprehension, so for all of the reading types, silent, oral, and being read to, each passage follows with comprehension questions, and it's done by the researcher giving it orally to the student and then receiving oral answers in response. And here is just a quick look at what that would look like. Procedural fidelity, so basically the recordings are going to be, each session is going to be recorded, and then it's going to be watched by an unbiased party who's watching to make sure with a checklist that each of the assessments, the script, the procedure, and order were followed. But then they're also going to rewatch it and check off student responses as well to try and get inter-observer agreement in the results found. This is also going to take place during the initial assessment, where the researcher themselves is going to have a script and they're going to be able to check off that they've followed everything. And copies of participant accommodation plans will be known and present for everybody doing this evaluation, because I want to make sure that if students have an accommodation plan, that it is being followed, because that is ensuring the most accurate results of student abilities. Also, researcher training is required for word identification, where the researchers are going to need to practice that and ensure that there's inter-observer agreement. For generalizability and maintenance, so the setting chosen for this study is applicable to other studies because teachers just have to ensure that they are able to use their classroom during their regular time, and those wanting to use this study will be able to implement it in their own personal locations. We also are using a well-known reading assessment type, the Morrison Formal Reading Inventory, which is credited and affordable for teacher use. For social validity, it is important part. Reading is a very important part of our culture. I would argue that there's not much point in being able to read if you're not able to comprehend the message it's trying to communicate. And it's also important to note that reading in students with ASD is not heavily researched, especially with the simple view of reading. But the simple view of reading is used in many special education classrooms in the United States today. So therefore, a survey will be sent home to all parents asking if it is important for them that their children are able to understand what they read and to give their reasoning why, just to help prove and show that reading is in fact important. And finally, data analysis. So a table will be used to present all student assessment scores based on the two forms of assessments received during this study. So examining the scores, seeing them together, we'll be able to kind of put them together and see how closely they relate to baseline, and therefore connect it back to which assessment type is most accurate in being able to determine comprehension difficulties. All right, well, thank you for listening to my presentation, and have a nice winter break.